The loneliest people rarely cry for help. They just order another drink. I didn't walk into Murphy's bar because I wanted company. I walked in because I couldn't stand the silence waiting for me back at my apartment. The place smelled like cedar, old leather, and the faint sweetness of bourbon that had soaked into the wooden floor over decades. A country song drifted softly from the speakers while rain tapped against the front windows, turning the street outside into a blur of silver lights. It was a Tuesday night, just after 9, the kind of evening when everyone else seemed to have somewhere they belonged. I chose the stool at the far end of the bar where no one could accidentally ask how I was doing. "Whiskey," I told the bartender. "Neat." He gave me a sympathetic smile that somehow made everything worse. I wrapped both hands around the heavy glass before taking my first sip. It burned all the way down, but not enough to erase the ache sitting quietly inside my chest. 3 weeks earlier, I thought I knew exactly what my future looked like. I had a fiancé, a downtown apartment we were supposed to move into together, and a wedding venue already booked for October. Then one ordinary afternoon, I learned he had emptied our joint savings account, canceled every payment, and disappeared with someone else without leaving so much as a goodbye. 27 years old, and somehow I'd become the woman everyone pitted without even realizing it. My phone buzzed again across the polished wood. Another message from my older sister asking if I was okay. I couldn't answer because I didn't know anymore. Instead, I turned the screen over and finished the rest of my drink. "Another?" the bartender asked gently. I nodded before he could change his mind. The second glass arrived almost immediately. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the skyline, and headlights reflected across the rain-covered pavement like broken stars. Around me, conversations rose and faded in comfortable waves. Laughter, glasses clinking, someone celebrating a promotion, someone flirting over appetizers. Life continued as if mine hadn't quietly collapsed. I stared into the amber liquid and wondered how many bad decisions could begin with something that looked so harmless. What I didn't notice was the man seated alone in the private corner booth behind me. He hadn't touched the expensive scotch resting beside his hand. He wasn't watching the television above the shelves or listening to the baseball game everyone else seemed interested in. His calm gray-blue eyes had settled on me the moment I walked through the door nearly 40 minutes earlier, and unlike everyone else who saw a woman trying to forget her heartbreak, he saw someone standing dangerously close to giving up on herself. I would learn his name later. Adrian Knight. But that night, he was only a stranger in a tailored black suit, quietly deciding whether one broken soul was worth changing the course of his own life. I lost track of how many songs had played while I sat there pretending that every sip made breathing a little easier. The bartender never rushed me, never asked questions beyond quietly sliding a fresh glass across the polished counter whenever I nodded. Maybe he had seen women like me before. Women carrying invisible heartbreak that weighed more than any suitcase. My fingers traced the faint ring-shaped mark on my left hand where my engagement ring had rested for almost 2 years. The skin looked strangely empty, like it had forgotten what it was supposed to hold. I laughed once under my breath, surprising even myself. It was not because anything was funny. It was because crying in public suddenly felt too exhausting. Across the room, the front door opened, letting in another wave of cool, rain-scented air. 3 well-dressed men stepped inside, talking loudly about business before choosing a table near the center of the room. One of them glanced in my direction for only a second before returning to his conversation. Everyone looked for a moment, then looked away. Everyone except the man in the corner booth. I could feel it now without actually seeing him. Not the uncomfortable stare I had grown used to whenever I was alone at a bar, but something quieter, patient, observant, as though he was trying to understand a language no one else noticed. I reached for my purse, planning to pay and leave before I embarrassed myself any further. My wallet slipped from my hand and landed on the hardwood floor with a soft thud. A few dollar bills and an old photograph slid across the room. Before I could bend down, another customer picked up the picture and handed it back with an awkward smile. It showed me standing beside the man I once believed would become my husband. I thanked him, folded the picture in half without looking at it again, and tucked it into my pocket instead of my wallet. Some memories deserved less space. The bartender quietly placed a glass of water beside my whiskey. "You should probably have this too," he said kindly. I smiled for the first time that evening. You are probably right. The water tasted colder than I expected, almost shocking me back into reality. I stood carefully, steady enough to walk, but emotionally drained beyond words. Outside, the rain had softened into a light drizzle, painting the sidewalks with reflections from passing cars and glowing street lamps. I reached for the door, unaware that another pair of eyes had already noticed something I had completely missed. Across the street, leaning against a black sedan, a familiar figure watched the entrance with restless impatience. The moment I stepped outside, he straightened, and every instinct inside the man still sitting silently in the corner shifted. For the first time that night, Adrian Knight reached for his untouched glass, set it aside without taking a single sip, and quietly rose to his feet. The cool air hit my face the moment I stepped onto the sidewalk, carrying the scent of rain, wet pavement, and the distant aroma of roasted coffee drifting from a 24-hour cafe across the street. I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders and started walking without any real destination. Going home meant facing empty rooms filled with memories I was not ready to unpack. Walking felt easier than standing still. My heels clicked softly against the sidewalk until another sound followed behind me. Slow footsteps, familiar enough to make my stomach tighten. I did not have to turn around to know who it was. Claire. His voice stopped me before I reached the corner. I closed my eyes for a brief second, hoping I had imagined it. When I turned, Ethan stood beneath the glow of a street lamp with rain collecting on the shoulders of his expensive coat. He looked exactly the same as the day he walked out of my life, confident, polished, and completely certain that he could explain away everything he had done. "You have been ignoring my calls," he said, taking a cautious step closer. "Because I do not have anything left to say." He sighed as though I was being unreasonable. "You are making this harder than it has to be." I laughed quietly, unable to believe those words. Harder for who? For a moment, neither of us spoke. Cars rolled past, spraying thin sheets of water onto the curb while neon reflections danced across the puddles between us. Ethan finally reached into his coat pocket and held out a small velvet box. My heart skipped before I realized it was empty. "I need the family ring," he said calmly. "It belongs to my grandmother. My parents want it back." I stared at him, unable to process what I had just heard. "You disappeared with everything we saved together, and now you came back for a ring?" He shrugged with an indifference that hurt more than anger ever could. "It is the responsible thing to do." I slipped my hand into my pocket, feeling the cool metal band I had carried with me every day without knowing why. Slowly, I pulled it out and held it in my palm. The diamond caught the glow of the streetlight before I closed my fingers around it again. "No," I said quietly. "This is the last piece of the life you destroyed. You do not get to decide what happens to it anymore." His expression hardened for the first time. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Claire, do not make a scene." Before I could answer, another calm voice spoke from somewhere behind us. "She already gave you her answer." Ethan turned immediately. "So did I?" The man from the corner booth stood a few feet away beneath a black umbrella, his tailored suit untouched by the rain, his calm gray-blue eyes fixed entirely on Ethan. There was nothing loud or threatening about him. Somehow, that made his presence impossible to ignore. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The rain continued falling in a slow, steady rhythm, tapping against parked cars and pooling along the edge of the sidewalk. Ethan looked from the stranger to me with obvious confusion. "This does not concern you," he said, forcing a smile that never reached his eyes. The man holding the umbrella remained perfectly still. "It concerns anyone who understands the meaning of the word no." His voice was calm, almost quiet, yet every syllable carried an effortless confidence that made the street itself seem to grow still. I glanced between them, trying to understand why a complete stranger had decided to step into a conversation that should have ended minutes ago. Ethan gave a short laugh. "I think you have the wrong idea." "I do not," the stranger replied. "She is leaving. You are preventing that." There was no accusation in his tone, only certainty. Ethan shifted his weight uncomfortably before turning back toward me. "Claire, tell him this is a misunderstanding." I looked at the empty ring box still resting in his hand, then at the ring in my own palm. Everything about the past 3 weeks rushed back at once. The unanswered calls, the empty apartment, the vanished savings, the promises that disappeared faster than the money we had spent years earning together. I slowly closed my fingers around the ring and slipped it into my coat pocket. "There is nothing to misunderstand," I said. I meant what I said. I am done. Ethan searched my face as though he expected to find hesitation hiding somewhere behind my words. Instead, he found only exhaustion. After another silent moment, he let out a slow breath and shook his head. You are making a mistake. Maybe, I answered softly. But this one will finally belong to me. Without another word, he looked once toward the stranger, then back at me before quietly turning away. Within seconds, his figure disappeared into the curtain of rain, leaving only the fading sound of footsteps and passing traffic behind. I stood there watching until I could no longer see him, surprised that relief felt so much heavier than sadness. Beside me, the stranger lowered the umbrella slightly, so it covered us both from the drizzle. Are you all right? He asked. It was such an ordinary question, yet I realized no one had asked me that without expecting something in return for weeks. I nodded automatically before catching myself. Honestly, I do not know. A faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth, warm enough to soften the sharp lines of an otherwise unreadable face. That is usually the first honest answer after a broken heart. I finally looked directly into his gray-blue eyes. You were inside the bar. Yes. You watched all of this. Most of it. I should have been embarrassed. Instead, I only felt strangely understood. He extended one hand with effortless politeness. My name is Adrian. I hesitated for only a heartbeat before placing my hand in his. Claire. The handshake lasted no longer than a second, yet something about that quiet introduction felt far more significant than either of us could have explained. Adrian glanced toward the quiet street before looking back at me. Where is your car? I let out a tired breath and almost smiled. I took a rideshare here. I was responsible enough not to drive after drinking. He gave a small nod of approval. Good. The answer was so simple, yet something about the way he said it made me feel oddly respected instead of judged. A black sedan rolled silently to the curb as if it had been waiting nearby all along. The driver stepped out, opened the rear door, then immediately returned to the front without saying a word. I looked from the car to Adrian with growing uncertainty. I cannot let you walk home alone tonight, he said, especially after what just happened. I folded my arms across my chest. You do not even know me. No, he answered honestly, but I know enough. The rain had almost stopped now, leaving only tiny drops sliding from the branches above us. I studied his face, searching for the hidden motive that experience had taught me every kind stranger eventually revealed. It never came. There was no pressure, no impatience. He simply waited. If I say no, I asked. He stepped back half a pace, creating more space between us instead of less. Then I will call you another rideshare. Wait until it arrives and leave. That answer caught me completely off guard. It was the first time in weeks someone had offered help without trying to control the outcome. I surprised myself by nodding toward the waiting sedan. All right, just one ride home. Adrian opened the rear door without attempting to guide me inside. I climbed in first while he took the opposite seat, leaving the entire middle section between us untouched. The car smelled faintly of cedar and fresh leather, and soft jazz played so quietly that it almost blended into the sound of the tires crossing rain-soaked streets. For several blocks, neither of us spoke. Downtown lights slipped across the windows like reflections from another life. I rested my forehead against the cool glass and realized how exhausted I really was. Emotional exhaustion settled into every muscle until even keeping my eyes open felt difficult. You do not have to stay awake, Adrian said gently. I am not afraid of silence. Something about those words loosened the tight knot inside my chest. I closed my eyes for only a moment, listening to the steady rhythm of the windshield wipers. When the car slowed again, I blinked awake to find we had stopped in front of my apartment building. Adrian never asked to come upstairs. He never asked for my phone number. He simply stepped out first, walked around the car, and held the umbrella above us while I climbed onto the sidewalk. Thank you, I whispered. He inclined his head with the same quiet composure he had carried all evening. Get some sleep, Claire. I watched the black sedan disappear into the damp city streets until its taillights faded completely, wondering why a stranger had shown me more kindness in one rainy night than the man I once trusted had managed in years. The next morning arrived with pale sunlight slipping through my apartment blinds and the dull reminder that reality always returned, no matter how badly you wanted to escape it. My head ached slightly from the whiskey, but the heavier weight came from remembering everything that had happened outside the bar. For a brief moment, I wondered if I had imagined the quiet stranger with the gray-blue eyes. Then I noticed the folded umbrella leaning neatly beside my front door. It was not mine. I smiled despite myself. He had somehow left before I realized I was still holding it. I spent the morning answering emails from clients who had postponed projects after learning my design firm was struggling. Every message felt like another door quietly closing. Around noon, my phone rang. It was a number I did not recognize. Normally, I would have ignored it, but something told me to answer. A woman introduced herself as the director of a boutique architectural design company downtown. She explained that one of their senior designers had unexpectedly retired and asked whether I would consider interviewing that afternoon. I frowned in confusion. I had never applied there. "May I ask how you found me?" I said carefully. "One of our business partners recommended your portfolio," she replied. "They spoke very highly of your work." After the call ended, I searched through my sent emails, convinced I had forgotten submitting an application weeks earlier. Nothing. By 3 o'clock, I was sitting inside one of the most beautiful offices I had ever seen, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the skyline. The interview felt less like an interrogation and more like a conversation between professionals who genuinely appreciated design. When I left, the director shook my hand warmly. "Expect good news soon, Claire." I walked outside carrying a cautious hope that had been missing for weeks. As I reached the sidewalk, another surprise waited for me. The coffee shop next door called my name before I even entered. "Someone already paid for your order," the barista said with an easy smile as she handed me my favorite latte. "They said you looked like you could use a better afternoon." "Who?" I asked immediately. She glanced toward the window. "I do not know." He had already left. I stepped outside and looked up and down the busy street. Business professionals hurried past carrying briefcases. Taxis rolled through afternoon traffic. Tourists studied maps beneath bright blue skies. Whoever had done it had disappeared into the city before I even knew to look. I stood there holding the warm paper cup between my hands, thinking about impossible coincidences. A perfect job opportunity. A coffee paid for by a stranger. Small kindnesses arriving exactly when I needed them most. I wanted to believe the world was simply becoming gentle again. Somewhere several floors above, behind the tinted windows of a black SUV waiting across the avenue, Adrian watched long enough to see the smile finally return to my face before quietly telling his driver, "That is enough for today." She deserves to believe she found her own way back. 3 days later, the offer became official. I sat in the conference room staring at the employment contract as though it might disappear if I blinked too hard. The salary was better than I had expected. The benefits were generous. The projects matched everything I had hoped to build before my life unraveled. "We would be honored to have you on our team," the director said with a warm smile. I signed my name with hands that trembled just enough for me to notice. Walking out of the building, I felt lighter than I had in months. It was the first decision that belonged entirely to me. My phone buzzed before I reached the corner. It was my sister. "Claire, I am so proud of you," she said after I told her the news. "Maybe this is your fresh start." I smiled at the busy street stretching ahead. Maybe it is. That evening, I decided to celebrate with nothing more exciting than takeout and a movie. Halfway home, I stopped at a neighborhood bookstore that had always made me feel safe. While browsing the architecture section, I noticed a familiar voice speaking quietly near the front counter. I turned instinctively. Adrian stood a few aisles away, wearing a charcoal coat instead of the tailored black suit I remembered. Without the formal jacket, he somehow looked even calmer, blending into the bookstore as though he had been there all afternoon. He looked up almost at the same moment and offered a polite smile. "Congratulations on the new position." I froze. "How do you know about that?" His expression remained composed, but for the first time I saw the slightest hesitation in his eyes. "Someone mentioned it this morning." The answer felt too smooth, too prepared. I studied him carefully. "Did you recommend me?" Silence settled between us while customers wandered quietly through the shelves around us. Finally, Adrian answered with complete honesty. "I introduced your portfolio to someone who values talent." My heartbeat slowed instead of quickening. "So it was you." "Only the introduction," he said. "The job is yours because you earned it." I wanted to thank him. I also wanted to be angry. Both emotions arrived together, refusing to separate. "You should have asked me first." He lowered his eyes for a brief moment before meeting mine again. "You are right." There was no excuse. No attempt to defend himself. Only acceptance. I never wanted to make you feel indebted. I only wanted one door to remain open when every other one seemed to close. I folded my arms, struggling to understand the man standing in front of me. Why would you do that for someone you barely know? Adrian looked toward the rain beginning to fall outside the bookstore windows before answering quietly. Because I know what it looks like when someone is carrying more pain than they should have to carry alone. His words stayed with me long after we walked out of the store together. And for the first time, I realized the greatest mystery was not who Adrian Knight was, but what kind of life had taught him to recognize heartbreak so effortlessly. Over the next week, my new routine slowly began replacing the old one. Morning coffee on the walk to the office. Meetings filled with sketches instead of apologies. Evenings spent rearranging furniture in my apartment until it finally looked like it belonged to me instead of the version of my life that had disappeared. I told myself I was moving forward. Then, on a quiet Friday afternoon, everything shifted again. I had just finished presenting my first concept to a client when the receptionist hurried toward my desk. "Claire, there is someone here asking for you." My stomach tightened before I even looked up. Ethan stood near the lobby windows, hands buried in the pockets of his coat. He looked tired in a way I had never seen before. Not defeated, just restless. I walked only close enough for us to speak comfortably. "How did you know where I work?" He hesitated. I asked around. Something about that answer unsettled me more than it should have. "Why are you here?" He exhaled slowly. "To apologize." I waited. He continued. "Leaving the way I did was wrong. I know that now." I searched his face, trying to decide whether I believed him. Months earlier, I would have accepted every word without question. Now I noticed how carefully each sentence had been chosen. "I hope you mean that," I said quietly. "Because I already forgave you for my own peace. Not because I wanted you back." His shoulders lowered slightly. "There is something else." He glanced through the glass doors toward the street before lowering his voice. "Have you been spending time with a man named Adrian?" My heartbeat paused. "Why?" Ethan shook his head. "Just answer me. That is none of your business anymore." He rubbed a hand across his face before speaking again. "Claire, there are people in this city everyone learns not to cross." I did not recognize him that night outside the bar. "I do now." I frowned. "Who is he?" Ethan looked genuinely uneasy. "Someone with influence that reaches farther than most people realize." Before I could ask another question, a familiar black sedan rolled quietly to the curb across the street. It stopped without urgency, as though arriving exactly when it intended to. Adrian stepped out wearing a navy overcoat, carrying nothing more threatening than a folded umbrella despite the clear afternoon sky. He did not hurry toward us. He simply walked with the same calm confidence I had come to recognize. Ethan noticed him immediately. The color drained slightly from his face. Without another word, he stepped backward. "Take care of yourself, Claire." Then he turned and disappeared into the crowd before Adrian reached the entrance. Adrian stopped a respectful distance away, studying my expression instead of asking questions. "You look worried," he said gently. I met his gray-blue eyes, realizing that for the first time since we met, I wanted the truth more than I feared it. "Adrian," I whispered, "who are you really?" I held Adrian's gaze while the afternoon traffic moved around us, as though the city had forgotten we were standing there. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the skyline before speaking with the same quiet honesty that had followed every conversation we had shared. "People have given me many names," he said. "Most of them are based on fear instead of truth." I folded my arms, trying to steady my breathing. "Are they wrong?" A faint smile crossed his face, but it carried no amusement. "Not entirely." He did not deny it. He did not invent excuses or hide behind carefully chosen words. "I built a business that requires difficult decisions," he continued. "Some people respect me. Some people fear me. That is their choice. But none of it changes how I chose to treat you." I searched his eyes for the first time without wondering whether he was hiding something. The answer surprised me. He was not hiding. He was simply refusing to pretend he had lived a different life. "Why me?" I asked softly. "Out of everyone in this city, why did you stop for me?" Adrian looked down for a moment before answering. "Because I recognized the look in your eyes." He paused. "Years ago, I lost someone I loved because I believed pain was something people had to survive alone. I promised myself that if I ever saw that same loneliness again, I would never walk away." The noise of the city seemed to fade into the background. Suddenly, the expensive suits, the black sedan, The quiet authority surrounding him mattered less than those few simple words. I realized he had never tried to rescue me from my life. He had only opened doors I still had to choose to walk through myself. You never asked for anything in return, I whispered. Kindness is not supposed to be a transaction, he replied. I laughed quietly, shaking my head. You make that sound so simple. It should be. We stood there smiling at each other while the first rays of evening sunlight slipped between the buildings, replacing the gray afternoon with warm gold. For the first time in months, the future no longer frightened me. It was uncertain, but it finally belonged to me again. Adrian offered his hand, not to lead me, not to claim me, only to walk beside me if I chose. This time I accepted without hesitation. As we stepped into the crowd together, I realized something I wish I had understood long before my heart was broken. The people who truly change your life are rarely the ones who promise forever. They are the ones who quietly remind you that you are worthy of tomorrow. Sometimes healing begins with a stranger who notices your silence. Sometimes hope arrives without asking permission. And sometimes the strongest heart in the room is the one gentle enough to help someone else find their own strength again.